Hi team, in this video I'm going to look at strong and sustainable economic growth. So this is the first of the 3 goals that you need to know. So you need to understand what the meaning of the goal is, how it's measured, and then the particular consequences it's going to have for our economy. So this is your definition, and I've tried to break it down. So what do we mean by strong? Strong means that we've got the highest rate of economic growth possible. And what do we mean by sustainable? It means that the rate isn't causing inflationary, external, or environmental pressures. And overall, economists in Australia generally agree that that's between 3 to 3.5% real GDP growth per year. So putting this all together, this is the definition that you need to use. If you ever have a question that asks about strong and sustainable economic growth, you need to have all these pieces in there. I've just taken a snapshot from the ABS website. So 11 things that happened in the Australian economy. I'll give you the full article, but looking at this bit that I've highlighted in green, over the quarter for December 2023, so we're only talking about the last 3 months in 2023, our economy grew by 0.2% during the December quarter and 1.5% in annual terms. So that basically means that for the 12 months prior to December 2023, so for the year, Australia only witnessed an increase in economic growth equal to 1.5%. So if we go back to our definition, if our goal is 3 to 3.5% per annum, it's pretty clear that we've not achieved the goal for the year of 2023. And so here's some more data. Really important to get your head around how to read tables like this, because you could get tables like this obviously in your SACs and your exam. So what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with GDP, chain volume measures, seasonally adjusted. Don't stress too much about the back end of that. Point is, you're looking at GDP data. And we've got quarterly information. So the quarter ended March 2022. So we're talking about January, February, March 2022. The quarter ended June 2022. We're talking about April, May, June 2022. So on and so forth. And then over here, we've got the quarterly growth rates for those 3 month segments, for those quarterly segments. So for the March 2022 quarter, the economy only experienced a 0.5% increase. Now, I want to show you all this because if you were to take the top 4 here, so 0.5, 0.8, 0.2, and 0.8, if you add all those together, you're going to find that we're nowhere near 3 to 3.5%. Similarly, again, in 2023, if you add all these numbers up here, 0.6, 5, 3, and 2, again, we're growing in a positive way, which is fabulous, but we're not growing at a strong rate. We could argue that maybe it's sustainable, but it's certainly not strong in the sense that we're going to have some issues with the growth rate being too low on our economy, and I'll speak to the consequences in a moment. So just showing you this because I want you to start to get used to looking at obviously the economic data in the way it may get presented to you. Okay, now this video, I need you to go and watch it in your own time. Basically, it explains what real GDP is. So we've been talking about GDP a lot. We're going to start to use the term real GDP. So real is just an economic term that tells us that the data has been updated to take out any inflationary pressure. So the number that you're seeing, you can compare it to the year before because the prices that have been applied are consistent. Now, if you think from one year to the next, ask yourself, what's going to happen to prices over time? We know that they're going to rise most likely. And so when we compare GDP data from one year to the next, and it shows an increase, that increase could be due to the increase in output, which is the bit that we want to isolate, but it could also be due to the increase in prices. So real GDP takes out the effect of those increase in prices to give us numbers that we can compare. In the sense that the only change that's represented in those numbers is going to be the increase in output that we're looking for. The video explains it in more detail. Obviously, if you've still got questions, please make sure you come and see me. Just quickly, the causes of economic growth. So we've looked at both these scenarios. We've looked at AD and AS changing, shifting to the left or the right, making sure that you're looking at the x-axis. So our x-axis shows us our real GDP. And in the case of an increase in aggregate supply, we see an increase in real GDP from Y1 to Y2. And in the case of an increase in aggregate demand, we see an increase in output from Y1 to Y2. So just from I suppose, a graphical perspective, These are the only two reasons why we're going to experience an increase in real GDP. Now, you know that there's a bunch of factors that underpin the reason for the curves shifting. So this is why it's really important that you know your factors, because if you're presented with one of those factors, you want to be able to explain its impact on the graph, and then ultimately its impact on things like, in this case, economic growth, but you can also derive conclusions on inflation and then unemployment as well. So making sure that you've got your 6 AD factors and your 9 AS factors ready to go, so that if one of them was proposed to you, you could draw your graph and then draw those conclusions. Okay, so the last little bit here is that we need to understand the consequences of economic growth. So in the syllabus, there's 3 of them related to when economic growth is too high, and then there's 1 related to when economic growth is too low. So just working through the first 3 in relation to if it's too high. The first one being environmental degradation. So if we are at a point where we are unsustainable in the way that we're growing, so we've got strong and unsustainable economic growth, it's too high, we're going to start to see some really undue pressure on our natural resources. And we summarize that in the form of environmental degradation. So pressure on natural resources becomes unsustainable, and then go on further, you can then link that to intertemporal efficiency. So if we are using our natural resources in an unsustainable manner, it means that we're consuming too many in the current period, and that's going to threaten future generations' access in the future. And that's a huge problem, obviously one that is quite pertinent in the media today. The second one's a little bit unusual, and it will make a bit more sense when we look at area of study 3 and we really go hard sort of looking at the international markets. But still, I want you to start to think about what external pressure is. So if we've got a situation where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, so I'm talking about this situation here on the right, okay? If aggregate demand is really pushing to the right in an unsustainable manner, we're going to have a situation where aggregate supply cannot keep up. So if AD is greater than AS, we're going to start to rely on imports a lot more to satisfy the wants and needs of society. And we do that anyway. We already import a lot of products, but if these imports get out of control because the Australian economy is just unable to satisfy domestic demand in a sustainable way, we're going to see a massive increase in leakages. So leakages in the form of obviously imports. Now, we're happy with imports, there's nothing wrong with them, but if they grow too quickly and those leakages become too great, we're going to be sending a whack of our money overseas, and that's going to have a lot of negative consequences on what we call our trade balance. I'm not going to cover that now, but when we get into it in area of study 3, it'll make a little bit more sense. For today, however, it is important that you understand that if we are sending more Australian dollars overseas, we are increasing the supply of those Australian dollars. Now think about it. If there's an increase in the supply for something, what happens to its price? So in the case of the Aussie dollar, if there's an increase in the supply of Australian dollars in the international market, we're going to see it start to depreciate. And that has a whole host of consequences for us too. So if the Aussie dollar falls too quickly, we're going to experience a decrease in Australia's purchasing power, and then that's going to have a whole lot of consequences in terms of our ability to then access imports that we're relying on to satisfy our out of control needs. So in essence, it's the mucking up of our purchasing power can obviously have some really bad consequences for our living standards, because we're no longer able to access those goods and services that we need. So, you know, it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, but once we get on that cycle, it's kind of hard to pull it back. So we don't want economic growth to be too high. We don't want that over-reliance on imports that mucks up our exchange rate and then inhibits our ability to best satisfy our wants and needs. And then the last one, guys, is high inflation. So hopefully we've spent a lot of time on this one. As the economy reaches its productive capacity, we know there's going to be way more pressure on the factors of production, which makes them more expensive. So if you're a producer, you obviously need factors of production. And if you're now needing to pay higher prices to access them, this is going to lead to an increase in your cost of production. And you're going to pass that on to the consumer. You're not going to wear it. And so ultimately what we start to see, team, is an increase in inflation. And as the last sort of 12 to 18 months have shown us, unsustainable increases in inflation obviously mean that we're now not in a position to access as many goods and services because our purchasing power has fallen. So just have a think for a moment how that could impact your living standards, both material and non-material. In terms of economic consequences, if it's too low, okay, so there's really only one that's listed in the syllabus, and this is the scenario I want to talk to. So if you've got a situation where output is falling, I've done this through the lens of a shift to the left in aggregate demand, but it could also be caused by a shift to the left of aggregate supply. A decrease in economic growth leads to a fall in output. If there's a fall in output, it's going to reduce the demand for labour resources in the production process. So ultimately, producers just don't need as many labour resources. So people will start to lose their jobs, and that means employment's going to go up. All right, so hopefully that one's nice and simple. I want to I do want to conclude this one by saying the syllabus requires you to link to living standards. Okay, it's explicitly stated that you're going to speak to the consequences of not achieving the goal and its effect on living standards. So for all 4 of these, I want you to think, okay, how is it that your access to goods and services might be changing? And how is that going to impact material living standards? And then the other piece there is also your non-material living standards. So those quality of life factors that we spoke to. So particularly in terms of environmental degradation, that's going to be a good one in the sense that if there's pressure on our environment and we start to see intertemporal efficiency falling, obviously what is that going to do to your quality of life? And then wherever you're able to derive an argument that links to purchasing power, well, that's going to muck around with your access to goods and services. So there's an in for material, guys. So just like we sort of started the unit looking at this stuff, I need you to start to draw it back to here going, okay, well, my purchasing power has fallen. I can't access as many goods and services. Therefore, my material living standards have fallen. Okay, that's the expectation. A question from last year's exam. So explain 2 consequences of not achieving the domestic macroeconomic goal of strong and sustainable economic growth for 4 marks. Now, let's just set the scene on this. If you ever see a question that mentions the goal, you have to define it, okay? If it's a part C, and in this case it is, and maybe you already define the goal in part A, you know you don't have to do it again. But if this is a standalone question and this is the first time you've seen the word goal of strong and sustainable economic growth in the question, you must set the scene by defining that goal. And it's a pretty chunky goal. It's a pretty chunky definition. So make sure you've got it. And then obviously from there, approach it as if it's sort of a 2x2. So explain the first consequence, state what it means, and then provide further detail. And then again, for the second consequence. So I've got a bit of a sample answer here. There's that chunky definition at the start that we have to have. You'll notice that I've explained the consequences, okay? I'm not outlining, I'm not stating, I'm explaining, I'm going a little bit further in my explanation. So basically I've said where the strong and sustainable economic growth is too high, obviously the use of natural resources is going to be unsustainable such that environmental degradation occurs. That's lovely, that's, probably going to get you a mark, absolutely. Take it a bit further. This threatens intertemporal efficiency where too many resources are consumed in the current period, threatening future generations' access to them, okay? Now, this question doesn't mention living standards, but if you wanted to make the back end of that explanation about living standards, go for it. What I'm really fishing for here is for you to give us that second sentence that gives us a little bit more detail that is obviously relevant to the consequence. I've attempted to sort of summarize the external pressure one too, because I know that it's probably the one you're looking at going, my least favorite. So let's have a look at this one. Another consequence relates to external pressure. So where aggregate demand is greater than aggregate supply, Australia will rely heavily on imports to meet the wants and needs of society. This leads to an increased leakages in the circular flow. It increases the supply of Aussie dollars, leading to its depreciation, thereby weakening Australia's purchasing power. Okay, so just a sort of way to think about external pressure as a consequence if you're not too sure about it. Obviously, if you go back to the question, you've got the opportunity to speak to the other 2 as well. So this is about not achieving the goal. So you could have talked about it being too low and that having negative impacts on unemployment. Likewise, you could have also spoken to high inflation. That's also an option for you. But just being really clear, team, that you do need to stick to the syllabus. The syllabus has 4 specific consequences that are listed. And this really is where the higher order thinking is going to live. So I would suggest that you make sure this one is ready to go in the lead up to your exam. I hope that makes sense. Please let me know if you have any questions.